Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish. My name is Brian Liddy and it's Sunday the 25th of February. Thank you for joining us. Today I have with us Maureen Watt. Maureen, you're a retired MSP and a frequent contributor, so good to see you again. Thank you for giving up a huge bit of your weekend for us. And we're also joined by Dr. Alan Flowers, who's with us on an independent capacity, but Alan's a Scottish scientist who's been studying Chernobyl nuclear disaster. You're also an environmental and human rights activist and a promoter of Belarusian and Ukrainian culture in the UK, and you're the chair of the Anglo-Belarusian Society. Thank you, Alan, again for giving up a huge bit of your weekend for us.
Good afternoon from London, although I'll be back to my home in Edinburgh tomorrow.
Okay, so and yourself again, Maureen, thank you. I'll start with our, sadly, routine Ukraine update, and today is day 731. The leaders of G7 countries pledged support for Ukraine and new sanctions on Russia after a virtual meeting on Saturday on the second anniversary of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. After the meeting, the G7 leaders didn't make any public statement about further military aid, but urged the approval of additional support to close Ukraine's remaining budget gap for 2024. They also demanded that Russia fully clarify the circumstances around the death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed Western leaders to Kyiv on the anniversary, declaring that Vladimir Putin must lose absolutely everything. 4 Western leaders, including the Prime Ministers of Italy, Canada and Belgium, arrived in Kyiv on Saturday to show their solidarity with Ukraine on the second anniversary of the war. Italy's Giorgia Meloni, Canada's Justin Trudeau, Belgium's Alexander De Croo and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, travelled to the Ukrainian capital together overnight by train from neighbouring Poland. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday he had signed a bilateral security agreement with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Kyiv. Canada joins Italy, Britain, Germany, France and Denmark in concluding a 10-year security deal with Kyiv. The agreements are intended to shore up Ukraine's security until it can reach its aim of becoming a member of the Western military alliance, NATO. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock in Ukraine's Black Sea port of Odessa on Saturday said Germany was still discussing whether to supply long-range weapons to Ukraine. The body of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has been handed over to his mother, a spokesperson has confirmed. Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Alexei Navalny, had demanded that Russian authorities release his body for burial and accused a demonic Russian President Vladimir Putin of torturing his corpse. Hundreds of people gathered at Marble Arch in central London to protest against Russia's invasion. Protesters bore signs urging Russia to stop the war, labelling Russian President Vladimir Putin a terrorist and urging international powers to offer more support. Swiss President Viola Amherd has said Russia is unlikely to take part at the outset of a high-level Ukraine peace conference, which neutral Switzerland plans to host in the coming months. Swiss Foreign Minister Ignacio Cassis told the United Nations that Bern aimed to hold the conference by this summer after the idea was floated in January. UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron warned allies in the United Nations against fatigue and compromise over Russia's war in Ukraine as he urged countries, including the US, to keep up support for Kyiv. The UK has pledged £8.5 million in humanitarian funding allocations to the Red Cross movement and the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. Protesters said they dumped 2 tons of dung outside the house of the Russian ambassador to Poland on Saturday as they marked the second anniversary of the invasion. Activists put a bloodied Russian flag with the letter Z on the pile of manure and stuck a sign into it that said Russia equals shit. Sorry for that. I'm ending on no, on the running order. I'm going to go straight. So yesterday was the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. After being initially surprised by Ukraine's resilience and resolve, the West slowly agreed to provide weapons and support that has always seemed to take too long and ends up being too little too late. Can Europe and the US risk Russia's invasion succeeding? Maureen, I'm going to come to you first. That was a lengthy update today. I suppose we can expect that on the day after the second anniversary. But what are your thoughts on where we are now?
Well, I suppose, initially, I suppose people thought that it was going to be, and indeed Putin did think it was going to be a short, sharp invasion and he would be able to take over Ukraine. And now, 2 years on, we can see that it's going to be set to be a long, drawn out war. It was good that there were protests and demonstrations and marking of the second anniversary in all cities. You mentioned London, but I think there was one in Glasgow too. Um, and I was listening to a Ukrainian lady on the radio this morning who was asked, how they felt, and she was very adamant that Ukraine was still solid and strong, and there was no wavering, and they realised that they had to stand against Putin, and that's why they want the West to back them up, because it's Ukraine today. Who is it tomorrow if um, we give in to Putin's um, um, ideas? Putin obviously has his dander up. He's going into a so-called election shortly, and wants to be seen as a strong man. And that presumably is why he's not taking part in any Russia won't be taking part in any peace talks that neutral Switzerland is going to um, host. I think it's good that that's taking part, and perhaps there'll be a united stance when Russia does decide, if it does, to come to the table. In terms of the weapons, I think it's shown, has it not? I may be wrong here, that armaments production, and obviously I'm kind of in two minds about armaments production, but it has been slow, and I don't know if Dr. Flowers knows whether the Russian economy is in a good position because of armaments production bolstering the economy. I don't know. So obviously, weapons are having to be made at pace in the West, and hopefully they'll be ready in time for a counter-offensive by Ukraine in the spring and summer.
Thank you, Maureen. Alan, I believe you were at the demonstrations in London yesterday, and I think you've also been in Ukraine a lot recently as well. Could you maybe just let us know what your what it's been like for you, and maybe you might want to address Maureen's question as well. Is Russia militarizing its economy?
No, it certainly has done, and I absolutely agree with everything Maureen has said there. A very, very helpful starting overview. Yes, I'm a British academic originating from Edinburgh and now mostly living there. Up until 2020, I was spending about 3 months in every year on various projects. I ran a very large program bringing students over from Ukraine on European money, which sadly all ran out and had to be stopped in August 2023 when my last contract ran out. And I own a small little piece of property, one of these little old houses in the country, very near Kaniv, where the great poet of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko, their sort of equivalent of a Robert Burns, is buried right in the centre of Ukraine. And yes, I've been there, not so much in recent months, but travelled to Lviv, which hardly seemed like it was on a war footing. The important point, let me just turn to that important point about Putin and his economy. Yes, I mean, it's well known and well publicised that he's got his armaments now on a very much a war footing and a war economy, and masses of rubles are billions of rubles are pouring into this war economy, which of course will prop up the Russian economy as long as the money can keep flowing. And of course, the money flows largely through his oil, natural resources reserves, and he's played a very deft hand in switching the income from Europe and Western countries, which was finally and all too late cut off after the war started, to countries like India and China. And therefore, it's really the cash flow. I mean, one way to strangle Putin, quite rightly, was attempts at massive sanctions, but they've got to be effective sanctions without loopholes. And I saw a very good analysis last week of how you sanction trade direct to Russia of heavy equipment, engineering, machine tools, but then Russia just sidesteps it by having Western countries do their legal exports to third-party countries. Kyrgyzstan and Armenia were mentioned in the report I saw. And then just basically relabeling, and they're able themselves, these countries, to send on and trade to Russia. So a number one point would be, yes, Maureen, your point to raise this question, what does the war economy look like in Russia? And I mean, reports from Russia indicate, the public there does see price increases. They don't see they're getting the same staple goods, the same volume, although it's a bit like what we sometimes experience in our supermarkets here. You suddenly see a product that was 500 grams labeled 440 that's the same price. The Russians are getting a lot of that actually at the moment. They are seeing commodity, they're seeing price inflation. That's about the one effect. There's also a very suppressed feeling amongst the Russian people. They've got fatigue as well, and are very aware in certain regions of the losses. But again, Putin's been very clever to make sure his losses largely took place from regions well away from Moscow. So he's decimating the sons of politically not very strong areas of Moscow and of Russia, and making sure that the strong political heartlands of St. Petersburg and Moscow, other large cities, don't see the same level of attrition. Of course, his recruitment campaign, this is where he's got to be very careful. If he does a mass recruitment and conscription, because that then would really possibly create considerable political damage. He knows that, and that's why he's currently on essentially the contract employed soldier scheme, whereby, okay, if you come from Moscow and you contract, the family knows that, and they're not really in much of a position to complain if it's been a very genuine volunteering to be paid for the money. I'd add one final point. We talked about fatigue, Russian people. There is a danger that we've got fatigue in support of Russia. And I'd say that events like have happened. I came down from Edinburgh on Tuesday for a week of major events by the Ukrainian community here in London, a very, very high level. The American Embassy hosted a very large thank you event to people working with Ukraine at the Palace Theatre in the West End on Tuesday evening. That really is a great morale raiser, and I'm sure it's certainly boosted support and donations. And we've heard all the strong words, and they couldn't come greater and more stronger than from the UK government. I mean, in this area, we've had complete all-party support, Scottish Nationalist Party, the Scottish presence in Westminster as well, very, very, very strongly supporting the British effort, if anything, with a slight message. Well, could there be any more, and could it be quicker? And I think this point, too little, too late, is very true. I mean, as an academic and scientist, I was fascinated by the delays over the Storm Shadow debate. This missile that's launched from aircraft, and I was at an event about a year ago with an eminent Air Vice Marshal saying, "Oh, this is not really going to happen. It's technical difficulties." Great mutterings about how difficult it was to attach these missiles to these former Soviet fighters. Funny, it's been done, but it just took time, and one's worried about this rather degree of tying one of Ukraine's hands behind their back. I mean, if Putin's going to leave these territories, that sadly is likely only to be by either force or by such a catastrophic degradation of the Russian economy, which eventually might happen. I mean, this money that's flowing at the moment, there is a good risk eventually that these sources reserves will run out. So, got to get on both fronts: the economic front, which Maureen's raised, and certainly the military front. And let's hope America stops messing around there, and that the views, which I would have thought are of the majority of the American people, to recognise support and learn that this really is a critical world fight that's taking place. Putin's only got to get one lesson out of this, and that is: you invade another country, you lose.
Thank you, Alan. We're kind of, time is very much against us, but can I just ask you really quickly? So, the US is blocking financial aid to the Ukraine, and Denmark recently said that they're going to hand over all of their munitions to the Ukraine, and Belgium is going to raise taxes on Russian money that's frozen in their bank accounts and give that to, I think, rebuilding the Ukraine. Do you think other countries should follow their suit?
Well, yes. By the way, just one small factual one. What Denmark's given is their artillery. All of it. They realise they don't really need that sitting where they are in Denmark. They're making sure they keep their air force in place, though. That's for sure. So it's limited. But yes, I mean, material that we don't need. There are huge stocks. By the way, one that I heard yesterday talking to Ukrainians, apparently Bosnia is a got massive artillery shell military production facilities. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be the hardware. If we just got money flowing in the right directions to locations where you can step up supplies fast, where the capability is there to do it, like remarkably in Bosnia, I researched this in too much detail. It was a discussion at the March. And by the way, the numbers really were very substantial. Yesterday, I know it's been reported in the media as hundreds, but these hundreds were certainly more than just a few. It really was getting into the thousands. Ukrainians do turn out, and that Trafalgar Square looked reasonably full to me yesterday.
Thank you, Alan. So we'll move on to the Israeli-Gaza conflict. So it's been a shameful week for British politics this week. Wednesday saw chaotic scenes in the Commons when Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the Commons, allowed a Labour amendment to the SNP Opposition Day motion. This unfortunately prevented the SNP motion from being voted on. Hoyle's actions broke years of convention and caused pandemonium. He apologised and said he had got it wrong. And then today we found out that Stephen Flynn, SNP leader in Westminster, is to accept Lindsay Hoyle's Commons Speaker's offer to allow a fresh vote on the new ceasefire motion. But I'm getting ahead of myself, viewers. So we've got a video of Alan Brown asking a question in the House of Commons about that on Thursday, the day after the pandemonium in the House over the SNP's opposition day motion for calling for a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So here we have a clip for you now.
This business.
Yes.
In that case, point of order, Mr Alan Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the point of order, I seek your guidance, and perhaps maybe as Chair of Ways and Means you might be able to give further clarity. As regards the response the Speaker gave earlier in the session there to the SNP Group Leader about the sequencing of the decisions they took. Now, yesterday, the guidance he gave at the start of the debate, that he said there was a precedent for taking another, the main party opposition amendment to the smaller parties amendment. But in the letter from the clerks, it's quite clear there's no precedent on that. He also said it was about having the widest possible debate. But then last night, the rationale changed to security, and that's where at the session just there, Mr Speaker really honed in on security being the primary reason for the decision he made. And he intimated that lives were at risk. Now, that's a very grave matter. Implicitly implies that the SNP motion as it stood was effectively putting members' lives at risk in terms of the decisions they were going to make. It implies that somehow debating the Labour amendment somehow takes away the security risk, which actually then infers an assumption in how members are going to vote. Why was the security concerns not shared with other party leaders? And what did the Security Service say? And doesn't this set a precedent that mob rule can actually change the business of the House?
So that was Alan Brown, MP, asking about clarification on what happened on Wednesday. But today, we now know that there is going to be a fresh vote on a new SNP ceasefire motion with concrete actions. Stephen Flynn said that the SNP had been stitched up by Westminster Labour's cuckoo amendment, in which stole the votes. Alan, I'm wittering on here. Can you maybe rescue me and tell me what you think about what's been happening?
Well, there were really two issues in that. I mean, I've been following very closely because the issues in Gaza, of course, concern us all, and even the fact it has certain links and ramifications in connection with the Ukraine war, which I've been more engaged with in the longer term. I mean, the two issues were, yes, Lindsay Hall allowed that other amendment from the Labour Party, which there's great claims that lacks any precedent, although the Speaker claimed he found one. But whichever way, it was a very non-standard process at that. Then we saw the votes go through, and of course in the House of Commons they have this procedure whereby the Speaker sort of calls all who say aye, and all who say nay. And they do a shouting vote before you get necessarily a division called. Now, I've watched very closely a few times that shout, and there was concern that the opportunity for MPs to file through the lobbies and thus be named as to which way they voted, and therefore go into the public domain, that was lost because the person in the Speaker's chair, actually wasn't Lindsay Hoyle at that time, it was one of the deputy speakers, I recollect. Yes, Winterton, the deputy speaker, heard, and the only thing she could hear was ayes. So she just said, okay, the ayes have it, and that was it. Now, if that happens, a vote goes through, and in that case, the amendment would have been passed on these ayes, without MPs filing through the lobby and being named. Now, I didn't hear any nays, but apparently, somehow or other, the opposition, those who wanted to vote against the amendment on the resolution, the other somehow didn't get heard, or they got caught out. So there was two things that kind of went wrong, and then afterwards everybody sort of cried foul and said, hey, hang on, we didn't get a division on that. Well, this is again about the rather archaic procedure that there's a shouting match, whether you get in the Westminster Parliament. I'm not sure about I can't remember the procedure. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that happening in the Scottish Parliament, which seems to run by a much more sensible set of procedures. So there we go. And at the end of the day, look, MPs file through lobbies and their names are put down with their views all the time. So I really don't buy this. This is a rather special security threat. The trouble is MPs are having threats all the time, and all too often there's threats on a whole range of issues. And sadly, of course, we've seen two MPs deceased in recent years by the threats ultimately being carried out. So very complex, very odd situation, and hopefully it's been now resolved, and MPs will get their chance to go on the public record with the views they have over this question of ceasefire. And of course, fundamentally, it's about the British government view on how quickly and how we get to the very much needed ceasefire, which I guess we're now wanting to move to discuss. I really just think we've got to put these shenanigans behind us, because we cannot get tied up in Westminster's very messy, archaic ways of doing politics, when the higher level thing is to put all the weight of Britain behind it, in my personal view, to get a ceasefire that will move to an enduring cessation of hostilities and a sorting out of the problems in that area by peaceful means, which regrettably seem very difficult.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, we definitely should say that. We're talking about arcane procedures again today, when really the most important thing is civilian lives in Palestine. But Maureen, can I ask you, is Flynn right? Was it a stitch up? And are we right to be sceptical? Because Ian Murray and Michael Shanks, Labour's two MPs in Scotland, both voted no the last time the SNP raised this issue in November, and then they got off the hook again on Wednesday. Didn't have to vote.
Yeah, it was a disgraceful scene, and it was a stitch up by the Labour leadership in cahoots with the Speaker to save divisions, save the Labour Party from the divisions within it on Gaza being exposed. I mean, I think the Westminster establishment have completely misread the mood of the country in relation to Gaza. And, for years it's been obvious that more and more of our young people are interested in this and are pro-Palestinian. And as I say, that has led to Labour and the Tories completely misreading the mood of the country on this. And I think it can be seen from the huge number of people who turn out for demonstrations in favour of the Palestinians in Gaza week after week. But I was interested in a paragraph from an article that Dani Garavelli did today for the Sunday Herald. And she said, "We may never find out exactly what behind-the-scenes machinations led Hoyle to change the protocol on amendments, but it is clear Labour's imperative was to avoid a civil war. This it did at the expense of the SNP, parliamentary process, the Speaker's reputation, and public trusts in our political institutions." So whether we are to have another debate, I understand, on Gaza, it'll be interesting to see if there are wording changes made to an SNP motion, but it must be that the normal protocol is held to, and regardless of any influence that Keir Starmer puts on the Speaker, these must be ignored because the Speaker hasn't come out well in this. The processes of Westminster haven't come out of this well. I agree with Alan that they are archaic and were devised in the era when there was simply a two-party system, and that's not the case anymore, despite them still not having proportional representation. So, yeah, not a good week for Westminster, and the whole issue at stake here and being debated here of the terrible atrocities in Gaza were completely lost. It was a dark day.
My understanding, Maureen, is that it is going to be a different motion that the SNP are going to be allowed to put forward, because Stephen Flynn said that there's going to be concrete actions included in the new motion. Have you any idea what they might be?
No, I haven't got any insight.
He did say that perhaps it might try and help the UK to vote for resolutions in the United Nations, because so far America and the US have been the only countries that have been voting against it in the UN. What about, do you think then maybe just quickly, does what happened last week just show that Scotland just does not get proper representation in Westminster and we just get pushed aside?
I think it shows that when push comes to shove, the SNP and Scotland's interest are completely shafted in order for them to keep their establishment going.
Thank you, Maureen. Alan, we're right on the cusp of time-wise, but is there anything that you haven't had a chance to say that you'd like to say briefly before we move on?
Well, only that the international community really, really has to bang heads together very, very hard on this. I mean, the Palestinian political leadership really has been bereft in this, because, of course, you've got the problem that the people elected Hamas, and then they entrenched themselves. It became a dictatorship. And we've got a worldwide problem with this, that individuals who use the democratic process. Lukashenko in Belarus is one example. I mean, now look at Putin too. They often get in on a free and fair election, take control. There's just no world system to raise the flag and the alerts early enough. And that's really right across the board globally. Western democracies have proven themselves very, very weak in drawing the line early enough. And I'm just left as an observer, largely outside the political system, feeling very, very badly served by our political masters. And Scotland has every right to feel extremely badly served by what is happening in Westminster.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, I think we all feel helpless bystanders. So the next item is there have been lots of recent reports about the ageing or decaying even Trident nuclear subs, including leaks and missiles transported by road through Glasgow. But a recent test firing of a Trident missile from a Royal Navy submarine failed for the second consecutive time recently in January. The latest test was carried out from HMS Vanguard off the coast of the United States, and these tests are rare, not because missiles cost about £17 million each. Defence Secretary Grant Shapps and the head of the Navy were on board when they fired the unarmed test missile in January. An anonymous source who was there said the missile left the submarine, but it just went plop. Then there's the cost of Trident, and Jackie Bailey often says that it creates jobs and it's valuable for that reason. But if you were to divide the cost of Trident and give it to each of those workers that rely on it for work, they'd all be multimillionaires. Many say Trident on the Clyde is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Alan, I came to you first the last time. So, Maureen, what's your view on Trident and the recent plop?
Well, from a very early age, I was at protests against Trident and missile systems and being based at Faslane on the Clyde. I think it's a complete and utter waste of money. And we see that more and more when, for example, in Ukraine, they're fighting trench warfare. And, spending on Trident missiles is not going to help the people of Ukraine. Is it a deterrent? I think increasingly it's not. We're moving towards more use of AI and different forms of terrorism in war. And I cannot see the justification for Trident. However, having said that, it can't be unilateral disarmament. It's got to be multilateral disarmament, in my own particular view. Although Britain could be seen as a leader in leading towards deterrence and the reduction of nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Maureen. Alan, I'd just like to bring in the US elections into the mix and the possibility that Trump might be re-elected as president and what that might mean for the ageing nuclear subs and for NATO. And then if I can pile on Putin, you mentioned earlier that he's ramping up munitions production, and I think he's also threatening to use nuclear weapons in space. Have you any idea what condition Russia's similar nuclear submarines are in? Are they in better condition or the same as ours?
From the few incidents that we're aware of and have known, extremely scary maintenance of military equipment, naval equipment, aircraft, the Air Force of all sorts is subject to horrendous lack of resources, because the resources pledged by the Russian government generally never get wholly through because of the horrendous corruption that exists in all the big spending programs in Russia. So the leadership might think they've got a well-maintained army, navy, and air force, and that includes these submarines. There's far more risk of things going wrong with these Russian subs than any of the Western ones. In the case, you're going to get one bit of controversy. I've got a huge respect for Maureen and all the work she did, particularly as an MSP. But I'm afraid on this nuclear deterrence one, I think there's one point I'd at least wish to raise and suggest Maureen maybe consider, and that is we've got to remember there are two countries that voluntarily gave up nuclear weapons that were stationed in their territory, and that was Ukraine and the country I do a lot with, Belarus. In fact, I personally know the person who did the negotiations, Andrei Sanikov, did the negotiations in 92 to 95 as a signatory for Belarus. Know a lot about that process of disarmament talks. And I've even met and spoken to the head of state of Ukraine, Kravchuk, who feels he was deceived over the process because what was written on the piece of paper, as we know, this is Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, and that was a deterrence. Now, it's all very hypothetical, but I wonder if a Ukraine that had their own nuclear weapons would have been a Ukraine that Putin would have invaded. Well, there's a question, not for now, and I don't mean to tempt Maureen forward, but I actually happen to be a supporter for the need for this deterrence, and we might not have liked the Cold War. So, I mean, as for the Trump point, I mean, I find that a very scary process. So the thing about Trump is he leads to an equation of uncertainty, and maybe that's one thing that does deter Putin. And as for his statement, I'll end the war in a day. Well, that's typical Trump rhetoric. I mean, we've got to separate what that man says in a campaign rally when he totally gets carried away with himself to the reality of the way even a president of the United States has their hands tied, like Biden does with the present vote. I'm very much wanting to get it through. So the only worry is if we get a Trump presidency, we've probably got a Trump Senate and a Trump House. So he will have a very strong Republican vote way to not quite the balance that Biden's having to put up with, where democracy is a long and slow process. And unfortunately, we're seeing that act when there are differing views in America at the moment over Ukraine. So, yeah, I find it a very worrying trend, and we're hoping something will happen. That's just a personal view of mine to derail Mr. Trump before November.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Maureen, you were wanting to come in there.
Yeah, just it's great having your knowledge on the programme this afternoon, Dr. Flowers. But who persuaded, was it the West that persuaded Ukraine and Belarus to give up their nuclear weapons?
I could answer that very briefly. I know Shushkevich for Belarus personally, and I know the Ukrainians had a similar view. She was president. Then he wasn't president, by the way. He was the head of state. They didn't organize their first presidential election was Lukashenko in '94. But the point is, it was very much Shushkevich and the people around him. And Shushkevich was a nuclear physicist. He basically said, "We don't want this stuff. Belarus would be obliterated." He was concerned if there was in the end a nuclear exchange, what would happen to his country? And the view of the Belarusians, this was the Belarusians. I know it personally. That man, the head of state, and his government, this wonderful Democrat, it was only a 2-year democratic period, Kravchuk as well, they did want rid of the stuff. They did not want to be engaged in a possible East-West conflict. You've got to remember, we're at the end of the Cold War, and there's still this issue about the tensions between Moscow, and let's get the capitals right, Moscow and Washington, London. And they just didn't want to be part of it. So I absolutely can assure you, if you were speaking to the people, sadly, both Shushkevich and Kravchuk died. They died in the first, just about a year ago, interestingly enough. They saw this war happen. But they died very, very sad men that somehow their decisions they made, they felt had let, in the end, the Ukrainian people down. They never could foresee, of course, nobody could foresee this sort of situation of a country so integrated, Ukrainians and Russians, members of the families, they've got families with family members fighting against each other. It's absolutely horrendous. But no, I can assure you, Maureen, nobody needed to twist any arms. They just wanted a good deal. All they wanted was a security guarantee. And the trouble is, that Budapest Memorandum, you've got to read it very carefully. Do you know the only guarantee they got? They got the guarantee that any issue, any invasion would be taken to the Security Council, because nobody thought Russia, sitting on the Security Council, would be involved in this. So our guarantee was fulfilled. A lot of people don't realize this. Guarantee we gave Belarus and Russia and Ukraine It was fulfilled. We took it to the Security Council, and of course, you've got an aggressor sitting on the Security Council. It was just a mess. So our guarantee proved, well, it wasn't so much a guarantee, our memorandum of understanding, But by the way, that's another thing. The languages, there's a real story behind this memorandum thing, because the English version, I think, just says agreement, whereas the Russian language version really has got a word guarantee. I don't know what the translators were up to in giving documents that rather had two different senses in two different languages. That's a bit of ultimate crazy diplomacy, and that's actually caused some problems, because Ukrainians will often come back and say, "What happened to your guarantee?" But then, okay, A, wasn't really the word guarantee in English, but B, even if it was, we fulfilled it. So, yeah, a lot of Ukrainians regretting they gave these weapons up, but they did want. I mean, in that respect, Maureen, your sentiment is very much in line with the sentiments of Belarus politics and Ukrainian politics back in 92, 93, 94, and they signed the memorandum in 95.
Thank you, Alan.
Hugely interesting. Hugely
Yeah.
interesting.
I suppose if there's one thing that we can say after this discussion is that if nuclear weapons are a deterrent, they should at least be able to function and not just plop into the sea.
Yeah, by the way, I'll add one thing to that as a tempting thing. Your producer, Linda, and I are working on getting the man that did these negotiations for Belarus, Andrei Sanikov, to come to Scotland in March. And Maureen, we'll have to make sure if he does come, I think a meeting with you would be wonderful. Then you get under the skin that your views and his were very much in line in 92, 93.
That's good. Well, we look forward to that then. But we'd better move on. So the Post Office Horizon scandal. Keir Starmer's questions at PMQs this week focus purely on allegations made by Kemi Badenoch, the business secretary, in a statement to Parliament that Henry Staunton, the former chair of the Post Office, was lying when he said that he was told to go slow on compensation for postmasters and limp to the next election. Maybe just to catch up some time. So it's Alan, it's your first this time. Let me try and think of a question for you. I did have one.
Well, I can give you my view on a quick view on this. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a total disgrace. We're talking about individuals who were virtually marched to the bank to pay up against something they hadn't a clue how it had happened, no time for redress, and told they were about the only ones when they weren't the only ones. People should have known that. And yet these same people have had to wait not just days, weeks, or months, they've been waiting years. I'm sorry, as a member of the public, this is beside me how in our democracy, when it's quite clear the will of the British people is get these people paid from the sources that have been responsible for this. And I mean, quite how knowing leadership seems to be so easy to slipperily get out of this. I'm just baffled by the whole way this has been allowed to run. Of course, there always was an issue, and this is one of the problems. I mean, in any huge enterprise like that, there's going to be the degree of actually genuine fraudulent activity, and the investigators were coming across this in the past before Horizon, so they knew, but they should have realised, hang on, there's something wrong here. We might get, I don't know what fraction of a percent of post office managers are corrupt and fraudulent, and then they suddenly see it rocket up when this Horizon comes in. Again, one has a lot of problems in where was the common sense and willingness to realise you got it wrong, and even when you knew you got it wrong, this horrendous cover up. So, I just joined the vast majority of the British public in screaming, for goodness sake, British government again, will you stop letting us down on this one as well? There must be a way to intervene and just cut through all this red tape inquiries that are spinning things out and, get the thing cleared down before more of these people die, having had the horrendous experiences that they have at the hands of post office managers. I mean, human beings make these decisions at the end. Okay, and the human beings got the computer programming wrong with crazy software errors, which again I've been fascinated in. They make nice case histories for teaching students, stupid mistakes that can be made. They've all got opened up into the public highlight. So, what more could be said? And I'm glad your programme is highlighting this. But quite why British government seems another example of this bereft Westminster government we've got.
Thank you, Alan. Maureen, Badenoch's statement was in response to a Sunday Times interview of Staunton. Her tone, I don't know if you heard her statement in the Commons, but it was very clipped. There was, a wee bit of animosity was very thinly veiled. As part of the statement, she claimed it was unfair to say that the government only acted after the ITV drama series, Mr Bates versus the PO. But that may well be true. They may well have been working on trying to sort it long before that drama series. But did the drama highlight how slowly the government is moving to fix things?
Absolutely, and it would still be moving slowly if it hadn't been for that drama. I mean, earlier on in the week, it was a case of who do you believe, Kemi Badenoch or Henry Staunton, and I think her statement and what has subsequently come out is that, why would Staunton lie anyway? What's he got to gain? And if he was taking notes of meetings, then I'm inclined to believe him. And somebody did say, a civil servant, I think it wasn't it? A head of civil servant said, just keep this going until we limp to the election or something like that, so that the Tories didn't have to pay out, and it was the incoming government's problem. But this, if Sunak wanted to show that he had some leadership skills and political skills, then he would take ownership of this and get, as Alan has said, these people paid what they are due in compensation sooner rather than later. And I think that would win him some points with the electorate if he did that. But that doesn't seem to be in their DNA, to admit mistakes and get on with sorting them out quickly and hiding behind, as you say, various public inquiries, a parliamentary inquiry and a public inquiry. And as we know, public inquiries can take years. And as Alan said, in the meantime, people who are due compensation are dying. It's an absolutely awful scandal.
Thank you, Maureen. Alan, we've still got a minute or two to spend on this story. Badenoch and Staunton both say they have emails and records to prove that the other is lying. Meanwhile, Badenoch, I think, is the only one that's protected by parliamentary privilege. What does that make you think or say?
I'd say, well, let's see the records. I mean, in any way, how evidential are they? As far as I know, I mean, there must be these correspondence or some notes. I mean, this business that we can't seems to be so difficult to unearth the actual documentary information. In the case of the CEO, though, my understanding was there were notes he took afterwards, which might unfortunately lead them into some question. Now, again, I really do think we've got to cut across this brickbats flying around. Aren't all the facts out there already? People lost their lives virtually. They were imprisoned. They were made bankrupt. They had life-changing financial catastrophe imposed on them. And hasn't it all been agreed, that system? I mean, it's been admitted even some of we know the details of the faults that were there. And they were very excellently brought out. I don't know why I had to take a television program about. I'm quite shocked and embarrassed. So there we go. Yeah, and I mean, they don't seem to have yet sorted out overturning. I mean, these people are stuck still. Also, you got to remember, with valid convictions, are on the record still. I mean, that side hasn't been cleaned up. So, I just don't know why Kemi Badenoch isn't spending more time making a call for these sort of things to be sorted out. We do seem to get lost in politics. I mean, a number of the issues we've talked about seem to have ended up as, personalised internal Westminster brickbats flying around and politics. I don't know. There's an awful lot of a call for a sea change. I mean, when I grew up, I had a huge respect for my politicians. There's not so many people around who have the sort of convictions. I do respect Maureen. On this one, we certainly fully agree, but we just don't seem to have the right people pulling the levers. I mean, if truth wants to come out, can we just see something that would stand up in a court of law as verifiable documentary evidence? And I don't know if we get that. An awful lot of these things seem to be at the level that there's a degree of uncertainty that's always going to exist, and therefore the jury's going to be out on it. You basically are having to make a judgment of what would be beyond reasonable doubt and rather circumstantial. I mean, to claim that this CEO, a rather high-ranking businessman, is coming back months later just to have a go at the government, to me, doesn't really stick all that well, actually. So I suppose if I was a jury member, my vote, and again, it is a balance of doubt because we've not seen the documentation, but circumstantially, I have to say the CEO's position does seem to be a little bit stronger than Kemi Badenoch's.
Yeah, I suppose both of them could be lying. But Alan, you mentioned you mentioned the deaths that have happened where people that are caught up in this heartbreaking situation. That's true. I mean, I think there have actually also been suicides over the matter. But we'd better move on to the next item. So, BBC Scotland has announced the cancellation of The Nine. That's their main evening news programme. They've also cancelled The Edit and 7 Days, which is the channel's weekly news review programme. They plan to replace The Nine with a 7 o'clock 30-minute news programme and will be cutting their news content from 250 hours a year, which was agreed with Ofcom, down to 150. However, Ofcom have got no option but to agree to the changes. The BBC Scotland are launching a new topical current affairs podcast and increasing live online reporting to replace it. The Scottish Government is concerned how the shift away from terrestrial to online BBC will affect viewers, and they've sought assurances. And in a recent interview, the SNP Culture Secretary, Angus Robertson, spoke to Broadcasting Scotland of the need for an independent public broadcaster in Scotland, and we've got a clip of that interview lined up for you now.
Support for independence or opposition to it is running at about 50-50, but if we look at our media landscape, it is on an editorial basis significantly opposed to Scottish independence. So that's not a real reflection of the fact that there's a balance of views on the issue. When it comes to broadcasting, of course, we want to have impartial journalism that is not down to one side or the other side. We don't have decision making here about broadcasting. We don't have an independent regulatory regime. This is what happens in other countries. At the present time, we subcontract decisions on this to the UK government, who often make bad decisions on our behalf. Let's just do what everybody else does, and let's have the provision of public service broadcasting in Scotland, including the many talented people that currently work here, but within the normal operating setup which exists in other countries.
So that was Angus Robertson. Maureen, as you were in Holyrood as an MSP, was broadcasting in Scotland anything that you ever worked on in your capacity?
No, I wasn't ever on the Culture Affairs Committee. But, Angus is absolutely right. Scotland hasn't got any independence in its broadcasting. In terms of the cutting of the Nine, I presume it's because viewing figures are low, and that's not surprising because it has become just a rehash of the news at 6:30, BBC Scotland News at 6:30. I think one had the expectation that it would be more of a detailed analysis of the news, some of the news items, but also looking at other things that had a direct effect on Scotland and more of an international outlook. I mean, I thought it was going to be more like Yorpa on the Gaelic channel rather than what it's become. So I'm not surprised that it's being axed. And if the BBC are then going to have a programme for Scotland, competing with Channel 4 news, where you do get a more interesting take on the news, then to me that was probably a recipe for disaster. And podcasts are all very well, but are they really taking off? And the online coverage of Scottish news is abysmal. It's often very, very late on coming online. And it's just kind of taken you get the impression from newspaper stuff. So it's just, to me, seems badly run at the moment, and certainly not reflecting the views of Scotland and Scottish people.
Thank you, Maureen. Alan, I think the Nine came about back in was it 2019. It's been going for 5 years, and my understanding is that Tony Hall, the then Director General, quashed plans to replace the current tired format of BBC News coming live from London. That's national news, which would often lead on things that are happening in the health service in England. And then followed by reporting Scotland afterwards. It's like the news where you are. And Scotland's news then being on par with the regions of like Yorkshire and the like. And a lot of people just seem to say that a lot of people think that Pacific Creek Key, that it was set up that on purpose that way to fail. What's your opinion?
Well, the BBC showed itself very capable of recognising Scotland as independent in a number of ways, particularly in relation to the health service during COVID. I mean, I remember the times I was down in London, I would switch on to get the stream for BBC in Scotland when we were looking for the daily reports. It was one way to make sure you got all of what Nicola Sturgeon had to say, rather than having to listen to Boris talking about the English dimension with a bit of a sort of overview, UK overview. So it's pretty horrendous. This suggestion to go down to 150 hours, I mean, that's less than an average of half an hour a day, with a country that has a different legal system, different education system, a lot of differences. So, even if it got as much as pro rata what an English region of 5 million would get, I would still argue that's not enough because of the specifics and the differences, and the fact that we got a Scottish Parliament as well, and all the reporting necessary for that. I'm just baffled. Now, I have to admit, I wasn't a 9 or a 7 viewer, and Maureen's quite right. I mean, these viewing figures were atrocious. I think they were talking about about 1,700 some evenings and down to 200, and then the night day before it was axed about 6,000. These are paltry figures, but that doesn't mean to say you axe that type of content. They need to improve the nature of content and much more debate, surely, on that channel about Scottish affairs. Why don't we have a question time dedicated to Scotland, current affairs debate, and also, much more incisive, as you rightly said. How did we end up with a rehash of the 6:30 news when there's, opportunity to do the sort of incisive, detailed analysis and research, fact checking, and all that sort of goes on for England? Baffled by it as well. I agree with Maureen on this one as well, 100%.
Thank you, Alan, for reminding us about content. I think that these changes were even brought about because we're completely out of time, but these changes, if I'm right in saying, were brought about because everybody agreed that BBC Scotland had handled the independence referendum really badly. Maureen would maybe just nod to see if that's true or not, or shake her head. I think it is, but we're completely out of time. There's just two things that I wanted to say before we go. So here at Broadcasting Scotland, we're going to continue to provide daily updates, Ukraine updates. I meant to say that earlier on when we were talking about the second anniversary in Ukraine. And just congratulations to the Scottish rugby team who won the Calcutta Cup for the 4th time in a row yesterday at Murrayfield. Thank you for letting me squeeze that in. Maureen, thank you once again for giving up another part of your many weekends that you spend with us and evenings. Alan, thank you. It was a pleasure, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you. Greetings from London. Can't wait to be back to Edinburgh tomorrow.
Excellent. So that is it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you could afford £5 a month or less, then please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We are only £500 short of our £10,000 target. And although the pressure has been eased, we still need to raise that £500 to pay our bills immediately, so we can then focus on securing the future of an independent broadcaster for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So once again, thank you to Maureen, thank you to Alan, and to yourselves for watching. Goodbye.